My son thought I didn't notice. For 6 months, he watched me forget words, mid-sentence, lose my keys, repeat myself over Sunday dinner. He thought it was all working exactly as planned. What he didn't know was that I had been aware of everything, every single detail, since the morning a woman named Claire knocked on my front door in Burlington and told me what she had seen him pour into my coffee. To mark the occasion of selling my commercial property on Appleby Line, I had booked a table for 3 at a restaurant in downtown Hamilton that I'd been meaning to try for years. Steak, good wine, a quiet evening with my son and his wife to celebrate what 31 years of hard work had finally produced. $1.8 million. Transferred clean. No complications. I had signed the papers on a Tuesday and cried in my truck in the parking lot of the lawyer's office on King Street. Not from sadness, but from something I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or the particular weight of a man who realizes too late that he spent his best years building something his family was already planning to take. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I grew up in Stony Creek. I spent 3 decades managing residential and commercial properties across the Hamilton-Burlington corridor, and I raised one child, my son, mostly on my own after his mother passed from cancer when he was 14. I won't pretend those years were easy. I worked 12-hour days, missed school events, fell asleep on the couch on Christmas Eve with a half-eaten plate of turkey in my lap. I told myself I was building something for him. A foundation. Security. The kind of start in life I never had. My son was 29 when I sold the property. He had been working for a mid-sized logistics company in Mississauga for about 4 years, earning a reasonable salary, though it never seemed to be enough for the life he and his wife had decided they deserved. They had bought a house in Oakville, beautiful street, beautiful house, very much beyond their means. The mortgage alone would have made me sweat. I helped them with the down payment. I told myself that was fine. Fathers help their children. That's what you do. His wife had come into his life about 3 years before all of this happened. I won't say I disliked her from the beginning, because that wouldn't be entirely honest. But there was something in the way she calculated a room when she walked into it. The way her eyes moved to the bookshelves, the furniture, the artwork on my walls, not with admiration, but with assessment. Like she was taking inventory. I noticed it and told myself I was being unfair. That I was a lonely old man projecting. I should have trusted my first instinct. The property had been on the market for 8 months. When the offer came in firm, no conditions, at asking price, I called my son first. He congratulated me, and I could hear something behind the enthusiasm, an alertness, like a dog who hears a bag of kibble being opened in another room. I ignored it. I was happy. I wanted to share that happiness with my child. Within a week, they had started coming around more often. My daughter-in-law brought casseroles. My son offered to drive me to appointments. They suggested I looked tired, that I seemed to be forgetting things. They mentioned, gently and with great love, that maybe I should think about what came next, that maybe managing my own finances at my age, with the kind of money that was coming, was too much responsibility for one person, that they only wanted to help. I thought they were being kind. I am embarrassed now at how long I thought that. The home care visits had started about 2 months earlier. Not because I needed them, but because my family doctor had suggested I look into a mild support program after I mentioned some fatigue and occasional headaches. It was nothing serious. I was 63, not 90. But I liked having someone come by twice a week in the mornings. The woman they sent was named Claire. She was in her mid-40s. Practical and matter-of-fact. The kind of person who makes you feel steadier just by being in the room. One Thursday morning in October, Claire arrived at my house on her regular schedule and found my son already there. He had let himself in with the spare key I had given him months earlier. He told her I had asked him to come by, which I had not. He made coffee. He was friendly, chatty, relaxed. Claire made notes and was professional and said nothing until the following visit, when she sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me very calmly and very directly that she had watched my son add something to my coffee from a small, unlabeled bottle he had taken from his jacket pocket. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything. She hadn't confronted him. She was a professional and understood she couldn't make accusations without being certain, but she had also been doing this work for 19 years and she was not willing to say nothing. She told me what she saw. She told me she thought I deserved to know. Then she asked me if I wanted her to continue the visits, or whether I needed space to process what she'd told me. I asked her to keep coming, and I asked her to help me. What I felt in that moment was not what I expected. There was no sharp grief, no explosion of rage. It was something quieter and colder, like standing at the edge of a frozen lake and realizing the ice you've been walking on for years is thinner than you ever allowed yourself to believe. I thought about my son at 14, sitting in the hospital hallway the night his mother died, holding a paper cup of hot chocolate and staring at nothing. I thought about every morning I packed his lunch, every drive to hockey practice, every birthday cake I ordered from the bakery on Guelph Line, because I couldn't bake and I refused to give him a store-bought one with someone else's name on it. I thought about all of it, and then I made a decision. I did not confront him. I did not change my locks or call the police or call my lawyer, not yet. Instead, I began to pay attention in a way I never had before. I listened differently. I watched the way my son and his wife exchanged looks when they thought I wasn't facing them. I noticed the specific moments when they brought up my health, my memory, my ability to cope always around others, always in front of my doctor's receptionist, or my neighbor, or my old friend Margaret, who had known me for 40 years, and who I later learned had been asked by my daughter-in-law whether she'd noticed me seeming more confused lately. They were building a case. I understood that now. The substance Claire had seen him add to my coffee, whatever it was meant to produce symptoms. Confusion, fatigue, disorientation, the kind of symptoms that, documented consistently over several months by enough concerned observers, might support an application for a finding of incapacity and a transfer of power of attorney. My son wanted control of my money. He had watched me sign papers for $1.8 million, and he had decided, perhaps with considerable encouragement from his wife, that the best path to that money was to make everyone believe I was no longer capable of managing it myself. I hired a private investigator through a firm in Oakville that a colleague from my property management days had used and trusted. I changed my coffee routine entirely. Switching to tea, I prepared myself and never left unattended. I had a conversation with Claire about what she could and could not observe and document in her professional capacity. I spoke to my lawyer, my own lawyer, not the one my son had casually suggested I might want to consult, and I began the process of updating my will, my estate documents, and the structure of my accounts in ways that would not become apparent until I chose to make them apparent. I told no one else. Not Margaret, not my neighbor Doug, who mowed both our lawns in summer and thought my son was a fine young man. Not a single person, because I had learned in those weeks something I wish I had understood earlier. That the people who love you with conditions are very good at making you feel like the conditions are your fault. The investigator's first report came back in November. It confirmed what I had already suspected and added details I had not. My son and his wife had consulted a lawyer about the power of attorney process. They had researched what documentation was required to establish incapacity under Ontario law. They had spoken to at least 2 people in my social circle under the guise of casual concern, asking questions about my behavior that were clearly designed to elicit answers useful for a legal proceeding. And my daughter-in-law had been in contact with a financial advisor, not mine, about the investment options for a large lump sum that had not yet been received. She was already planning how to spend my money before she had it. I read that report twice, sitting in my truck in a Canadian Tire parking lot, because I didn't want to read it in my house, where the room still had 40 years of memory in the walls. Then I drove to Tim Hortons, ordered a large tea, and sat in a corner booth for an hour thinking about the kind of man I wanted to be at the end of this. I did not want to be the man who destroyed his son publicly. I did not want headlines or police stations or family court. What I wanted was something more precise than punishment. I wanted him to understand, fully and permanently, what he had given up and what he had chosen instead. The celebratory dinner had been my daughter-in-law's idea, which was itself a small piece of dark comedy. She had called me 2 weeks after the property sale closed and suggested that we celebrate properly her word, properly at a restaurant she had been reading about in the Hamilton Spectator. She had made the reservation herself. She had even sent me a reminder text the morning of. I accepted, of course. I had been looking forward to it. I arrived first and was shown to the table near the window. The restaurant was warm and low-lit, the kind of room where people speak quietly, and the service is thoughtful without being intrusive. I ordered sparkling water and looked out at the street and waited. My son arrived with his wife 12 minutes later. He was dressed well. He always dressed well. Something I used to take as a sign of self-respect and had since reconsidered. His wife wore a cream-colored blouse and the kind of smile that seems warm until you've seen it enough times to notice it never quite reaches the eyes. They sat down. They were cheerful. They asked about the closing process, about what I was planning next, about whether I'd thought any more about perhaps downsizing from the house. I ordered the rack of lamb. We talked about nothing for 30 minutes. While the bread basket came and went, and my daughter-in-law drank 2 glasses of wine with the focused pleasure of a woman who believes she is celebrating in advance. At some point during the main course, my son excused himself to use the restroom. His wife and I sat together in the easy silence of 2 people who have nothing genuine to say to each other. She refilled her wine. She told me the lamb looked good. I agreed that it did. When my son returned and sat down, he was quieter than he had been. I noticed it. He had taken slightly longer than expected, and there was a particular quality to his composure, a little too careful, a little too arranged. I have since wondered what he was thinking about in those minutes. Whether he felt any hesitation. We ordered dessert. The conversation moved to Christmas plans, to my daughter-in-law's sister who was visiting from Calgary, to a movie they had seen. And then, over his crème brûlée, my son began very gently, very naturally, the way you begin something you have rehearsed, to talk about a financial planning service he had been reading about, something tailored for retirees managing significant assets. He had a name, a contact. He thought it might be worth a call, just to get a second opinion. I listened. I nodded. I thanked him for thinking of it. Then I took a sip of my tea, set down the cup, and told him that actually, I had already made some decisions about the money. He looked at me carefully. His wife set down her spoon. I told him that I had been doing a lot of thinking over the past 2 months, that selling the property had clarified things for me in ways I hadn't expected, that when you spend your whole life building toward a number, actually reaching that number forces you to ask what it was all for. He nodded along. He was still wearing the careful, arranged expression. I told him I had decided to establish a charitable foundation. I named it after his mother. I told him I had already worked with my lawyer to transfer a significant portion of the proceeds into it, tax-efficiently structured, managed by a board of trustees, dedicated to funding cancer research programs at Hamilton Health Sciences. The remainder was in a trust I had established for myself, managed by a professional trustee who was not a member of my family and who reported to a committee rather than to any single individual. I watched his face. I told him I had also updated my will, that I had reviewed the power of attorney documents and had assigned those powers to Margaret, who had agreed without hesitation when I asked her last week, that I had changed the locks on my house and the passcodes on my accounts, that I had closed the account from which he had, on 4 separate occasions over the preceding 8 years, transferred small amounts to himself without asking, something I had noticed years ago and had never addressed, and for which I took some responsibility for allowing to continue. The restaurant was quiet around us. Someone 3 tables over laughed at something. A server cleared plates nearby. My son said nothing for a long time. Then he said my name. The way you say someone's name when you are about to argue with them. I told him I wasn't finished. I told him what Claire had seen. I told him about the investigator's report. I told him about the conversations his wife had been having with people in my life and about the lawyer they had consulted. I didn't raise my voice. I kept my tone the way you keep a road salted in winter, functional, clear, no skidding allowed. I told him that I had decided not to go to the police. Not because what they had done wasn't serious, it was, but because I had been this man's father for 29 years, and I was not going to spend the remaining years of my life watching my son be prosecuted. That was a kindness he did not deserve, but it was mine to give. What I was going to do, I told him, was exactly what I had already done. The money was protected. The access was removed. The foundation would do good work in his mother's name, the woman he had apparently decided was less important than a mortgage in Oakville. And if he or his wife ever again attempted to interfere with my finances, my health decisions, or my personal affairs, I had documentation sufficient to take legal action, and I would not hesitate. My daughter-in-law said something then. I don't remember exactly what it was, something about misunderstandings, about concern, about how none of this was what it looked like. I looked at her for a moment, and then looked back at my son, because the person I needed to say the next thing to was him. I told him that I had spent his entire childhood trying to give him a life better than mine, that I had worked myself hollow, so he would never have to wonder whether the heat would stay on in January or whether there was enough for both the grocery bill and the dentist. I told him I did not regret any of it, because that was true, and I have always believed that regret about what you gave freely is a kind of spiritual poverty I refuse. But I told him that what he had chosen to do, what they had chosen to do together, had answered a question I had been afraid to ask for years. The kind of person my son had become was not fully my fault and not fully my responsibility to fix. I had done my part. The rest had been his choices, made by an adult who understood exactly what he was doing. I left enough on the table to cover the bill and the tip. I pushed back my chair, put on my jacket, and wished them both a good evening. I walked out into the November air on King Street and stood on the sidewalk for a minute, watching the cars and the people and the lights of the city I had lived near my whole life. It was cold the way November in Hamilton is cold. Not cruel, just honest. A reminder that things end and change, and that the warmth you want has to be made, not inherited. I drove home, fed the cat, and called Margaret. We talked for an hour about nothing in particular. She told me about her grandchildren. I told her the lamb had been very good. My son has not called since that evening. I didn't expect him to. Not immediately. Whether he ever will is something I have accepted I cannot control, and I have made my peace with that in the way you make peace with bad weather. Not cheerfully, not without grief, but practically. The foundation held its first board meeting in January. We awarded the first research grant in March to a team at McMaster studying treatment-resistant breast cancer. I attended the announcement and shook hands with the researchers and thought about my son's mother and how she would have found the whole thing both moving and slightly excessive because she was that kind of woman. I have coffee with Margaret on Tuesday mornings. I still see Claire occasionally, though I no longer need the home care program. I am renovating the back deck of the house on my own. Slowly, the way you do things when you're in no particular hurry to finish because the work itself is the point. I didn't find what I was looking for in the anger. The anger was real, and it was necessary, and I don't apologize for it. But it was never the destination. What I found, in the months of quiet, careful work, the documents, the meetings, the long drives thinking through every step, was something I hadn't expected to find at 63. A version of myself that was no longer waiting to be needed. I used to believe that the point of building something was to pass it on, that the whole transaction of fatherhood was this long, patient accumulation of money, of lessons, of love that you eventually handed over to someone young enough to carry it forward. I built my life on that idea for 30 years. What I understand now is that what you build belongs to how you built it. To the cold mornings and the rough negotiations and the decisions made in good faith with imperfect information. You can share that. You can try to teach it, but you cannot give it to someone who was never interested in learning it, no matter how much you love them. The money I kept, the foundation I gave, the lesson I earned. That, I think, is the only kind of inheritance that was ever truly mine to give.